Hey, RetconRaider here. I'm still compiling and processing all of the data from the Boulder design documents, so this week I thought I'd go ahead and throw together a quick little video about one of the less explored aspects of Fallout Van Buren, namely, the character perk system. I touched on this back in my very first video about Van Buren. Unfortunately, although the designers had some pretty lofty goals for the game's perk system, it was left largely unfinished. And while we've received a lot of information since the game's cancellation, there's not really much in there about what the designers had planned in regards to perks. That's not to say that there's no information available, just that what we do have is heavily fragmented. While we may never know what all of the planned perks might have been, there's still enough information to at least give us a good idea on what direction the developers were going in. And before we get started, I should note that none of these perks had any proper art assets assigned to them. So with that in mind, I'll try to illustrate them with appropriate images from the other Fallout games where possible. Now, when it comes to talking about the perks planned for Van Buren, it breaks down into roughly 5 separate categories. The first category is made up of perks returning from one or more of the previous games in the series. These perks are generally mentioned one or more times in the leaked design documents, either referenced in an NPC's stat block, or referenced as part of something that the player can do if they have the relevant perk. This includes several basic staples of the perk system, such as Action Boy, Adrenaline Rush, Animal Friend, Better Criticals, Bonus Move, Bonus Hand-to-Hand Damage, Bonus Ranged Damage, Die Hard, Flexible, Gain, More Criticals, Sharpshooter, Strong Back, Tag, Thief, and Toughness, all of which had rather basic mechanical effects. Some of these perks likely would have been tweaked a bit to work with Fallout Van Buren's revised combat and character mechanics, but for the most part it's generally safe to assume that they would have largely functioned the same way they did in the earlier games. A bit more curiously, there were several perks which appeared to be exclusive to specific NPCs. These perks generally allowed the NPCs to break the rules in some way, or justified some aspect of the metaplot, or prevented the player from disrupting certain integral story events. For example, Coleridge, one of the final bosses of the game, possessed multiple unique perks that largely served as justification to control the way he interacted with the player. One of his unique perks was called Detect Lies, which essentially made him immune to the deception skill, allowing him to automatically see through any attempt the player made to mislead him. Coleridge also had a unique perk called Cult of Personality. This is a perk that did appear in the previous games, where it prevented NPCs from reacting negatively towards the player based on their reputation. In Van Buren, it would have essentially been used as justification to prevent the player from reacting negatively towards Coleridge. This would theoretically prevent the player from simply deciding to attack Coleridge and potentially derail the main plotline, instead allowing Coleridge to determine when and where the final battle would be fought. Similarly, Victor Presper, the main antagonist of the game, had multiple unique perks as well, such as Inventor, Master of Sciences, and Smartest Man on Earth. Although these perks all have rather colorful and pretentious names, it's hard to imagine what kind of actual tangible in-game effect they might have had. Inventor, for example, granted Victor Presper a plus 25% bonus to all his invention rolls, but it's hard to imagine that they would have actually programmed the NPCs to abide by the rules of the game's crafting system. So why would Presper require a special perk that would provide him with what amounted to a crafting bonus? This same question could be asked about Otto Steed's unique perk, Living Tool Set, which allows him to make repair skill checks without the need for a proper toolkit. It seems peculiar that the developers would create a new, unique perk just to allow a specific NPC to do something that he could have emulated by simply having a toolkit in his inventory. In other cases, unique perks were generally much tamer, simply granting small bonuses to various combat abilities. It's possible that some of these are perks that the player might have actually been able to acquire in the final game, but at the moment we can't know that for certain, since they're only referenced in regards to specific characters in the documents. Born Leader, for example, provided a bonus of +1 agility, +2 combat sequence, and +10% to all skill rolls for both Coleridge and any of the men within his area of influence. Duck and Cover, a perk only mentioned on one of Coleridge's men, granted a flat bonus of +15% damage resistance and +2 damage threshold against explosive attacks. Interestingly, these two perks are rather similar to perks from Fallout Tactics, Leader and Hit the Deck respectively, just with slightly different mechanical effects and new names. Other unique perks possessed by some of Coleridge's men were Forced March and Unbreakable. Forced March had the significant effect of doubling their fatigue levels, making it much harder to knock them out or otherwise disable them in a non-lethal manner. Unbreakable granted higher resistance to crippling injuries, making them much more resistant to the side effects of targeted attacks made using VATS. The design documents also mention some other potential NPC exclusive perks such as Bonsai and Born Killer. Unfortunately, they don't offer any details on what those perks were intended to do, though it's likely they provided more basic combat bonuses. The design documents also mention a number of special perks that the player could obtain as unique rewards for resolving quests in certain ways. Talking a certain NPC into killing himself, for example, would reward the player with the special Devil's Tongue perk, which granted a +5% bonus to all deception skill checks. Persuading that NPC to instead go on living would grant the player the special Guidance Counselor perk, which would instead provide a bonus of +5% to all persuasion skill checks. Similarly, completing Bear's recruitment quest by beating him fairly in hand-to-hand combat would have granted the player the unique Sting Like a Bee perk, which would have granted them a permanent bonus of +5% to their critical chance, but only when making unarmed attacks. If the player got on the good side of the Hangdog tribe, then they would have been able to unlock the special Hangdog Fighting Style perk, which would have given them access to special combat maneuvers focused on making lunging or tripping attacks. And much like other games from the Fallout series, the player would have been able to get an assortment of cybernetic implants in Van Buren, each of which would have granted the player a special perk. We don't have a full list of those planned cybernetics, but we do know that it would have included both the Nemean implant, which essentially served as subdermal armor, and the Phoenix implant, which made the player more resistant to heat and energy-based attacks. That's about the extent of what we know about the planned perks, at least based on the limited information available in the design documents. But fortunately, there is one other prominent source of information about the perks planned for Van Buren, namely Josh Sawyer himself. During the game's development, and in the years immediately after the game's cancellation, Sawyer often discussed the team's plans with fans on Interplay's forums. This is where he discussed the general design philosophy behind the perk system in Van Buren, and he gave several examples of perks that they had been planning to work into the game. One perk, for example, was called A, perk with a name clearly inspired by the Fonz, a character from the classic sitcom Happy Days. If a player with this perk failed to pick a lock, then they could hit the lock to trigger a second immediate skill check to see if it opened anyway, though doing this would also make noise and potentially alert other NPCs in the area. Then there was Body Snatcher, a perk named in honor of the classic horror movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers. This perk allowed the player to salvage pieces of defeated opponents' outfits. If enough pieces were collected, then they could be assembled into disguise kits, which the player would be able to use to influence their interactions with certain factions or NPCs. This perk clearly inspired the disguise mechanic that was later implemented into Fallout New Vegas. Another two of the perks that Sawyer revealed were part of the design team's effort to make the game's trading system a bit more interesting: Bulk Trader and Junk Merchant. Bulk Trader would have provided the player with a scaling bonus to their profits based on the quantity of an item that they were selling at once. The higher the quantity, the more they would be offered, which would encourage the player to hoard certain resources until they felt they were ready to broker the most profitable deals possible. Junk Merchant, on the other hand, served almost the exact opposite function. It represented the player's ability to convince NPCs to pay them more money for what amounted to minor pieces of worthless trash. With this perk, the player would receive triple the normal trade value for any items that were individually worth 5 or less caps apiece. This would have made it much more profitable to pick up junk items that the player might have otherwise been better off ignoring. Another perk that Sawyer revealed was Eye on the Prize, a perk which would allow the player to see what was in an NPC's inventory or a container without having to access it first. This would allow the player to quickly scout out how dangerous an NPC might be, or whether it was worth stealing from an NPC or wasting resources to crack open a locked container. Sawyer also discussed some of the potentially game-changing combat perks, such as In Your Face, a perk which would have been a boon to close combat-oriented player characters. As long as a character with this perk remained adjacent to an opponent, that opponent would suffer a minus 10% penalty to all of their ranged attacks, and they wouldn't be able to make called shots on specific parts of the player's body, representing how the player was using their melee expertise to disrupt their opponent's ability to properly aim in close quarters combat. Suicide King was another combat-oriented perk, but this time it was one that influenced the player's companions. In Van Buren, the player would have been able to control their companions directly during combat, unless a companion's hit point total dropped below a certain amount. At that point, the companion would take over and generally attempt to flee battle. But a player with the Suicide King perk would essentially disable this mechanic, allowing them to retain control of their companions no matter how badly they were injured. Triage was a much tamer perk, which allowed the player to immediately diagnose any living creature they looked at. This would provide the player with information such as hit point totals, fatigue, damage thresholds, special attributes, and special status effects, providing an invaluable edge in combat. It was essentially just a modified version of the Awareness perk from the earlier games, and it obviously inspired the version of the Living Anatomy perk which later appeared in Fallout New Vegas. One of the most interesting perks that Sawyer teased us with was Mental Catalog, which gave us a glimpse at a mechanic that isn't mentioned anywhere else. Apparently, the game would have had an identification system in regards to the items the player found, with skills and attributes determining if a player could identify any given item. If the player found an energy weapon, for example, they might not have been able to identify it without a high enough intelligence or science skill, making it more difficult, if not outright impossible, to use. The Mental Catalog perk would have allowed the player to automatically identify every item they came across, making it much easier to determine what was worth holding on to. Unfortunately, that's all of the perks that Sawyer revealed during his time on the Interplay forums. But it's still not the only information that we can glean from his work on the Van Buren project. He also worked on an in-house tabletop version of the Fallout rule system, which Black Isles used to help them test out different scenarios while they were designing Van Buren. An incomplete version of this tabletop rule system was also posted online, and it included some other additional perks which may have ended up in Van Buren if development had been completed. Details on these perks are generally a bit rougher since the tabletop version of the game was much simpler than the one that would have actually been used in Van Buren, but it does give us an idea of how those perks would have worked. For example, perks like Advanced Research, Gunsmith, and Pharmacist were clearly intended to help players who wanted to dive into Van Buren's complex crafting system, granting bonuses when they attempted to manufacture devices from certain qualifying categories. Curiously, Sawyer's tabletop version of the game also included perks carried over from Fallout Tactics, but often given slightly different interpretations. This includes perks such as Bonehead, Rad Child, and Tough Hide, which showed that the Van Buren developers were at least considering bringing over more content from Fallout Tactics. And sadly, that does cover everything we know about the character perks that were planned for Fallout Van Buren. It's not much, but it at least gives us an idea of what the developers were thinking. It reinforces the idea that the developers wanted perks to be more than just simple numerical bonuses, with each perk potentially changing the way the player actually played the game. And while we never did end up getting to experiment with all those creative and interesting new perks, we can at least take some consolation in the fact that this design philosophy was still carried over into Fallout New Vegas, a game that was, of course, developed by Obsidian, a company that includes several of the original members of Black Isle Studios, including Josh Sawyer. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got more design documents to wade through. So for now, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Fallout Van Buren, you can check out all 700 pages of the design documents for yourself by visiting the Fallout Wikis. Links are in the description.